Thanks for tuning into the For Those Made to Do podcast. We are your hosts, Mandy Sahota
and Bianca Pavel. This podcast is all about the doers who have achieved career success in the UAE and the stories that go with it.
In this episode of For Those Made to Do Sustainability, we discuss the impact of adopting more sustainable habits as an individual and consumer, and how to live in a more sustainable way. We address themes such as understanding what carbon credits are and how they are measured, as well as the importance of identifying your own carbon, waste and water footprint.
If you'd like to learn more about stakeholder capitalism and the case for degrowth, the common language Gen X, Z and Alpha must learn in order to address climate change, and the role of the gig economy and the global carbon market in the future, then make some tea and join the party. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome back, everyone, to a new episode of For Those Made to Do. Today, we are unwrapping sustainability, a word that's been making many headlines for the past few years, and a space where ministers, business leaders, academia, and civil society are now turning most of their attention to. Throughout history, there has never been a more pressing challenge to solve with higher stakes for humanity. As world delegates come together to COP28 Dubai this week, we're sitting down with a climate expert to break down where we stand in the race to zero and what priorities we need to set next. So today, we're welcoming Michelle Lee to our studio, a very powerful voice in the climate space. Michelle is the founder of two successful initiatives, Clever Carbon and Women in Climate. She is a TEDx, South by Southwest and Bloomberg speaker, a UN contributor, and a podcaster. Also, she's a Holt alumna from our San Francisco MBA programs. Michelle, we're so excited to sit down with you today and so lucky that COP28 brought you over to Dubai these weeks. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I just got into Dubai and very excited to be here with you two.
Thank you so much for coming, Michelle. Let's begin with a warm-up question. Bianca and I visited your website, clevercarbon.io, and we took the quiz to measure our own carbon footprints. My results came back with 28 tons of carbon, which seemed quite daunting as a number. So what I would like to ask you is, what is your annual carbon footprint, first of all, and what does 28 tons of CO2 mean? And what does it take to offset it?
So my carbon footprint is around 22.1 tons the last time I measured it. And it can change because there are activities that I'm doing, for example, flying to Dubai, that add to my carbon footprint. And just looking at 28 tons, for example, your carbon footprint isolated is a little bit out of context. We need to look at it through the lens of the average in your country, right? So you live in the UAE and the average footprint there is around 21.4 tons. In the US, the average is around 17.0 and the global average is around 6.3 tons. And there's some context there, right? But the UN also states that we need to be at around 2.1 as a global average by 2030. So that's a lot of work to be done.
So a lot of work to do, I think. I think a large part of that 28 tons comes from being an expat and flying back home and to other places. But I'm definitely going to work on it now that I know there's a benchmark. So I mentioned your platform, clevercarbon.io. Could you tell us a bit more about Clever Carbon and your mission?
Yeah. So at Clever Carbon, we teach people about carbon footprint in a really hip and fun way. And in my opinion, carbon literacy is the foundation for accelerated climate action that scales, because a lot of people are doing great things, but if you can't measure it and if it doesn't have a scalable impact on carbon, we just don't have a lot of time left. And so we really need to focus on solutions that work and solutions that scale. And, we talk about carbon footprint a lot, but I also want to mention that water footprint is important, waste footprint is important. So we don't want to leave that. We want to keep that in mind as well. But the reason why I think carbon literacy is so important is we understand numbers. Our human brain likes numbers. So when I say to you 6.8 on the Richter scale, you know exactly what that means. And you know you need to call your friends and family that live in a region where a 6.8, earthquake took place. Whereas if I said 2.1 on the Richter scale, you would be like, oh, I'll just text them to see if they're okay. But who knows what the Richter scale is? no one knows what it is, how it's calculated. And the important part is we understand numbers, and it simplifies everything. And the same is true for carbon footprint. We don't really need to know, the complexities behind the calculations, although it is helpful. But, if I told you the average meal that's vegetarian is around 600 grams of CO2 emissions per serving, a serving of chicken is around 1,300 grams of CO2 emissions, and a serving of beef is around 7,700, I don't have to say much, right? You already understand the impact and the scale, and you can make more informed decisions, whatever those decisions are. And so at Clever Carbon, we teach the basics like that, but we also help people understand the bigger picture. So in October, the average CO2 concentration in the atmosphere was around 418 parts per million, right? So parts per million is kind of like the Richter scale. It's a very complicated number, potentially, although really it's just concentration. But, we don't hear parts per million very often, so it sounds intimidating, it sounds daunting. But at the end of the day, it's a number. In October, it was 418. At its highest point this year, it was around 424. And experts say that if we surpass 450 parts per million, we will surpass the 1.5 degrees Celsius target set by the Paris Agreement. And we need to be at or below 350 parts per million for a thriving planet. And many experts actually say we need to be at or below 280 parts per million. And so how do we get from 418 parts per million to 350, right? If we reach net zero, that means we're not adding any additional carbon. So maybe we remain at around 418 and 420, although if we get there in 2030, we'll probably have added a significant amount of carbon to the atmosphere. We do not get to 350 parts per million without removing carbon. And that is the key question. That is the key understanding. And I'm going to take this a step further than I normally do. But think about, where you live in the city. It's a little bit hard to think about it in Dubai, but let's say you live in a city where it snows, right? Your government will keep you safe. And how does it keep you safe? It keeps you safe by helping remove the snow and salting the streets and making sure traffic and, pedestrians are safe. Now, imagine the amount of carbon in our atmosphere is like we have glaciers on the road. You just can't see it, right? Our governments need to step in and help us remove that carbon and remove that snow. But unless people are carbon literate, we don't really understand the problem and the challenge.
That's really, really interesting to learn about. And I think it's something that everybody needs to learn more of. And I'm just kind of trying to shift the conversation a bit at a macro level. COP28 is happening here right now, this week in Dubai. And as we speak, 70,000 global delegates are joining forces to advance the climate agenda. So I'm just curious about your opinion on this. What long-term strategies should GCC countries in particular prioritize in the next few days in order to ensure a sustainable future?
I wouldn't say that it was something specific to GCC countries. I think this is true for all countries, is that we need to prioritize things that we can do now, today. I think there's a lot of focus on, well, in 2030, when XYZ is true, no, we need to do things now. And some of those things that we can already tackle today is, for example, food and the way we consume food, whether it's food waste, the type of food, going more plant-based. We need to do those things because global emissions, from a food perspective, agriculture and animal raising makes up about 25% of global emissions, and commercial flying makes up only about 2.1%. So collectively, if we made more changes to our food system, we could actually get more scale and reduce our impact. So I think it's important that we focus also on things that we can do now. I also think that it's important for us to focus on how do we reduce our impact, right? Because there's a lot of talk about renewable energy. Let's bring more renewable energy online. But that's actually very energy intensive. And today, most of it is actually being brought online by fossil fuels because it's the main resource that we have today. There's nothing wrong. It's not good or bad. It's just the facts and the truth. But how do we reduce our need for energy in the future? Even just by curbing our habits at home, we waste a lot of energy. We turn things on when we don't need to. We have the temperature too cold, not necessarily too cold, but probably we could withstand a little bit warmer. But, because it's a little bit more comfortable, we turn the temperature down when it's hot and we turn the temperature up when it's warm. But can we reduce that? Can we be more mindful of where the energy vampires are, whether it's where we work or in our home? And we need to focus on things like that, because if we're bringing on more renewable energy in a world we're just, irresponsibly using energy like crazy. And if we think about AI and EVs, there's just so much energy that we're going to be using in addition to what we already are now. We need more capacity for renewable energy, which makes it even more challenging. So what can we shave off individually now, I think, is also important.
We concentrate on that individual impact. Now, if I just think in relation to myself, I gave up seafood for a year and a half. And when I would tell people, they'd be like, oh my God, especially in Dubai, we consume a lot of seafood here. It's kind of one of the main popular cuisines. And I think people were kind of like, well, what difference is it going to make? You're one person. And that was the reception I received quite a lot every time I would say, hey, I'm out, I'm not eating seafood. I also don't eat beef for a similar reason. And that's not to condemn anyone that does, but it was a conscious choice that I made. But then the retaliation that you get is, well, anyway, the fish is in the supermarket already. It's already been harvested, same as the beef. So it's kind of the mindset is of that, saying, well, what impact can one person make? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you've lived in the UK before, and you can see the footprint of vegan items in UK grocery stores, right? When you go to London and you go to a Tesco, there's like a whole section for plant-based meats, for plant-based, options and solutions. So one person individually, you think, oh yeah, that doesn't make a lot of difference. But actually, I think individually, especially as we share our reasons why we do certain things, it does lead to change. And consumers have so much power. They don't even understand truly, right? If you leave a review on Amazon, if you leave a review on Yelp or, Google Maps for a restaurant, like restaurants listen to those and they take the feedback. And when I go to restaurants, I will call out, oh, had lots of vegan options. It was really great. Or, oh, could use a few more vegan options. I didn't really have much to eat. So like using your voice and taking individual action, I think is absolutely important. And global supply chains are going to change, and they already have. And I think AI projected that by 2075, like most people would be plant-based.
Well, that's good news.
Yeah, it's positive to hear. I like it.
Yeah. And just continuing on that train of thought of impact and also action, I think in the last few years, we've been hearing almost everyone talk about sustainability, and particularly individuals have been really conscious of what they buy and where they buy it from and what the source is and so on. But I'm just interested in your opinion at a more macro level, if we were to zoom out, who has made the biggest difference in the last few years between consumers, corporates, and governments, and also in terms of that accountability of who should own impact and action in the space?
If you look at companies like MasterCard, their business is fueled by consumer spending. And MasterCard is doing a lot when it comes to sustainability initiatives, from their Planet Price Coalition to they have a trees initiative, and they are doing a lot of work. And they're educating consumers also on conscious consumption. So they have a carbon calculator that allows consumers to connect their purchases with the impact that they have. And banks are adopting this and bringing it to their customers. So I think there are various players, from corporates all the way to individuals, that are really driving change in this area.
I was actually at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and it was on the topic of sustainability. And we were talking a bit about accountability, and somebody gave a great example of airlines. And they said, yes, airlines pollute a lot, but they also allow you to buy back your carbon footprint, right? Just offset your footprint in that sense. And then this gentleman's question was, do you do it? How many people actually pay extra to offset their carbon emissions when they fly? And then it prompted the other question of, well, should I spend more to offset that, or should the airline spend more because I don't have a say in where the airline is getting their fuel? I don't know how they make these decisions. I think the airline is prioritizing profit. Why should I pay extra instead of them changing their practices? Where do you think that accountability lies right now between corporates and consumers?
Such a great question. So, if you look at some of the larger corporations, they not only measure their emissions, their first line of defense is to reduce their emissions. And then what they don't reduce, they buy offsets. So if you think about companies like Stripe, Shopify, Microsoft, and a handful of others, they do that. They offset their emissions that they cannot reduce. And if we look at airlines, if airlines offset their emissions, then consumers wouldn't have to, right? We don't really have a choice on, like you mentioned, what aircraft are they using? What type of fuel are they using? What's the quality of the offset? We have no idea about these things. And to be honest, most consumers at this stage don't really understand what it means to offset as well. But if the airline did, then, consumers wouldn't have to. But at the same time, I still think it's nice that there is a reminder to the consumer that they are adding to carbon in the atmosphere. So is there something else that could be done? So for example, if you bring your own cup, you get $5 off. Or if you eat a plant-based meal, you have some incentive to do something. And actually, if you pack lighter, your ticket is going to be cheaper, because that's really what makes flying expensive, is the cost of fuel. And that's why when you check a bag, you have to pay. And when you check a second bag, you have to pay. And when you check a third bag, it's disproportionately more expensive because fuel is expensive. So if there were other ways to incentivize customers and consumers to reduce their impact when flying, that could be more interesting.
Absolutely. I love those ideas. And I think I would be on board with all three. So I think someone might tap you up after this, Michelle.
Wonderful.
And get you to consult. Maybe Emirates is listening. Who knows? Another initiative that you're currently working on is called Women and Climate. What are women uniquely bringing to the table in this sense when it comes to solving climate-related challenges?
In my experience, women like to roll up their sleeves and just get shit done. If I think about Clever Carbon and probably the 20 to 25 volunteers and interns we brought through since the last 3 years, 96 or 97% of them are women. And if I think about, at Women in Climate, the amount of our community members that reach out to say, hey, I want to volunteer, what can I do? It's incredible to see. I think women enjoy taking action, rolling up their sleeves and helping. And to them, it's not about the return of money for their time. It's knowing that they were able to have an impact on something. So I think that women just take action in general, and they enjoy it. So if I also think about things that we can do today, let's think about composting, right? Composting is something that I enjoy doing. And when I travel and I go to Airbnbs and, I have my groceries, I save up my compost. I could just not fathom throwing something into the garbage bin. And I think those are things that we can do today because, our food waste, it goes to the landfill and it actually produces methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And most people don't know that. And composting can be very impactful because you're removing that step. So, women like taking action and they enjoy these individual actions, whether it's eating plant-based or composting.
I read somewhere that women are better at thinking ahead, and for the collective as a whole. I don't know if that's a biological thing or like a maternal instinct or something that we carry throughout the generations. And do you think then, rather than thinking about profitability and like the individual, that's where this kind of initiative was born from, and what's been the outcome?
Yeah, I started Women in Climate originally because of two main reasons. One is I was new to climate and I was going to these networking events, and It can be a very intimidating and daunting experience, and I want to talk to people about Clever Carbon and, scaling climate literacy and carbon literacy and taking individual action. And the people at the networking events were not interested in talking about those things. They wanted to talk about the next unicorn in the climate space and how they were going to make money out of the climate space and how they had the best solution. But, no one wanted to talk to me about composting and all those things. So I wanted to find my tribe. And my second reason for starting Women in Climate is thinking back from my corporate career working at companies like Salesforce and DocuSign. I worked with so many incredibly smart and passionate women who loved philanthropy and giving back. If we even took 5% of their brain to think about sustainability, these are the people that are going to be speaking up in the corporate space saying, hey, workplace services, can we have more plant-based snacks in the kitchen? Hey, HR, what about a cleaner 401k for retirement? Can we have that option? So my idea was if we could activate more of these women, give them a safe space where they could learn and start their climate journey, we could really create this movement. And I think Women in Climate today does accomplish that. But I also think that we've become a very big community for women who are already working in climate, whether they're entrepreneurs or working at climate-based companies, and giving them a voice through various initiatives.
So a lot of what we've spoken about so far is around immediate action that we can take and really kind of easy, tangible things that we can do that will kind of shift the needle, like Bianca said. When we talk about sustainability, we often hear it's not that simple. There is no instant switch and businesses must focus on profitability over climate impact. What is a lesser known problem that prevents businesses from embracing sustainability as part of their core?
It's definitely not that simple. And I think it's really hard to be a business today. There's, on the one hand, businesses that are being appointed as greenwashing, where they're not doing enough. And then there's also green hushing, where they're doing a lot and they're not actually talking about it because they don't want any attention in a negative way. And I think that it's very, the normal stuff like profits, right? If you are returning a certain level of profit to your shareholders, if you change, there may be a lull and your margins may go down and your investors and your shareholders may be upset. And if you take a look at Unilever, they're a really interesting example where they really took a hard stance and their previous CEO took many measures and actually sacrificed profit for a while for a longer term sustainability plan that would actually be better for the business. And now that a new CEO has stepped in, they've changed a lot of those things and they've walked back some of their, promises. So I think sometimes we don't think about investors as being a key stakeholder, but they are. And investors can really go either way. They can actually drive your business to be more sustainable, or they could drive your business to really focus on the margins today. So we think about like supply chains and whatnot, but investors actually play a really important role as well. And looking at a company's investors, I think will tell you a lot about their sustainability initiatives.
And on this topic of greenwashing, do you have any kind of indicators that you could share with us to help us identify these brands a little bit more and do a bit more diligence, I guess, when we're engaging, if we do want to take a more conscious approach where we're putting our buying power and our spending power as well?
Yeah, I would say looking at the transparency of the company and of the initiatives that they have. If they claim a certain thing, can you actually track and see the data to back what they're doing? Sometimes companies have labels. So for example, carbon labels, where they will share the emissions of the entire life cycle of the product. That's a very transparent way to share data. And especially if they have a write-up on the methodology, that's even better. And some brands that are doing that today include Allbirds. They're a shoe company based in the US. And there's also Panties. They're a Brazilian period underwear brand. And they both carbon label and they write up how they do it. And not saying that everything is perfect, but trying your best and being transparent is important. And I actually don't have a problem with greenwashing. I know this is a controversial statement, but I would rather companies, talk about sustainability initiatives than not talk about it. And I think at some point, governments will have to come in to regulate and put some policies in place to make sure companies are actually doing those things and set certain standards, right? When, we first started with calories and nutrition labels, there probably wasn't a lot of guide rails around that, but now there is. And there's a consistent framework that we use. And the more we talk about sustainable initiatives, the faster we will get to these frameworks and guidances.
When we talk about some of the brands you've mentioned have been more kind of SME on the scale, some are kind of larger corporations like Unilever. What are the challenges for the SME? Because I feel like if you are a company like Unilever, we're putting them on blast quite a lot. I don't know why, but if we use them as the example in this instance, they have a lot more resources. They have a big kind of corporate strategic machine and marketing machine that can kind of contribute to all these things to feed the message to the consumer. But how about for the SMEs when they don't have that kind of level of resource?
I think the challenge for the SMEs is the scale and the economies of scale. They have an ability to really take big action because they don't have traditional processes in place. They don't have the same expectations from shareholders, etc. So they can do bold things. But sometimes bold things cost a lot. And as a result, the product is more expensive. And we have this concept called the green premium, where if something is more sustainable, it's more expensive. And unless you reach scale, you cannot bring the price down. So I think that's really what is challenging for SMEs, and also educating consumers to then shift their spending to those SMEs. Reaching that large audience is also very, very tricky.
Yeah, it can be quite difficult because there's a bigger conversation there around affordability and who can afford to go organic, sustainable, even vegan. When you look at plant-based alternatives, sometimes they can cost as much or even more than meat in some cases. I've definitely found that to be the case here in Dubai. When I was looking at some products from Beyond Meat, the burgers were actually more expensive than the beef burgers on the rack. So there really is that point of we would all love, as consumers, would all love to jump on that wagon to support sustainable practices, to buy from sustainable businesses, but can we actually afford that on the long term? So until, like you said, we reach that economy of scale, there is going to be a divide between those that can do it and those that would want to do it but can't quite do it yet. So on that note of what kind of unifies us, intergenerationally speaking, I think that global warming in particular is one of the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities that us millennials and also Gen Zers and Gen Alpha, who are coming behind them, who are very young right now, they're in school, will ever have to come together to solve. But in order to get there, I think we all need to agree on what is important. So I'm curious about what you think we all need to agree on in terms of language. What are some basic concepts that we all need to fully understand in order to get there? And also, what are some priorities that all three generations need to come on board with in terms of where we go next to solve this big challenge?
I'm a big advocate of literacy in general and numbers. We have a saying, what gets measured gets changed. So even starting with carbon footprint and carbon literacy, knowing how to prioritize your actions based on data. I shared some numbers around the average carbon footprint of a meal, right? Having that as a baseline, I think, is important. But also just understanding other basic metrics about ourselves. What is the average water usage per person per month? Probably no one knows that,
No.
right? How much energy did you use last month? You probably know how much energy
I know how much I'm paying for,
Yes,
but I don't know
exactly.
what exactly
The number
how
is,
much I'm
right?
using.
And how does that change month per month? How much waste are you producing? How can we get metrics around that? I think those are really important ways to communicate that are facts and where you can really compare with each other. And Bianca, you made a comment about, millennials and Gen Zs and alphas. But think about who's in our government today who really has the ability to speed up and accelerate action through policy. It's not our generation yet or those younger than us. So we all need to come together, and we probably have a couple years to do that. So I don't really think we necessarily need to think too far down the line. We need to think within the next 5 years.
So who do we need to influence in the government, people with decision-making power, in order to get there? I think that's incredibly important. And I know that the government here in Dubai is doing a lot in that space, but there's still so much more to do. And just to share a personal anecdote, I just moved here from the UK 6 months ago, and I was very, very used to recycling back home. It was just something I was mindlessly doing. I didn't even question it for a second. And then I get here and there are no recycling bins, shamefully. Now, I know that there is a recycling scheme in place, so it's going to be deployed very soon, and they're kind of trialing it. So it is coming. But the fact that Dubai hasn't been recycling by habit, by default, up to this point is actually quite surprising, right? So there's still, wherever you live in the world, you're thinking ahead and you're thinking, what are some big things that need to change? What about policy? What about the government? But also, there are the everyday bits that we all need to change. And I still recycle. I know there's no separation. I still have 2 bags, and I'm hoping that when they sort it out, they'll say, okay, this is clean plastic. I can totally recycle this. Hopefully it goes to the right place. So this is a podcast focused very much on the future of work and careers and industries and how they're impacted by mega trends. What are some emerging industries that you think will take shape in the next 5 years as we ramp up towards 2030, which is when we have that big climate milestone?
Yeah, I think infrastructure is going to be very important. Engineers, manufacturing, for all the renewable energy that we need to bring online within the next 5 to 10 years. So making sure we have the talent that can, equip themselves, whether it's the physical work or the work behind the desk, I think is really important. There's also a lot of talk about carbon markets and the different carbon credits and different initiatives and projects that can help remove carbon. And I just had a conversation with a professor at UCLA on this. He's working on a project that essentially removes CO2 from water, from our oceans. And it's very hard to find students and to find engineers to be staffed in those projects because there's so many different options out there, and the longevity of this ocean-related project is not proven yet. So it's very hard to recruit. So, if we have more people who are educated in this space and, bringing even carbon into the curriculum, I'm sure there are universities out there that are doing that today, will be really, really important.
And just because you touched on that, can I bring you back to carbon markets? Can we just explain what it is?
Yeah, so there are 2 types of carbon markets. There's the voluntary market and there's the involuntary market. And essentially, governments have some certain rules for high emitting industries where they have to offset some of their emissions, and that's the involuntary market. And then there's the voluntary market where you bring on carbon credits that regular companies can buy. There's no mandate for these companies to essentially purchase these credits, but because they want to do good business or because they want to be a good corporate citizen, they may go and purchase these credits. And so essentially, we're going to see a big shift in terms of the volume of credits being put onto the market, the voluntary market. We're already seeing that with companies like Microsoft committing to going real zero, which is different from net zero. But we have some challenges today in terms of bringing on high quality carbon credits. It's very hard to measure. The technology can be really difficult. and it's expensive. So if you have a carbon removal credit versus a carbon reduction credit, there's also differences in there. So it's a very complicated landscape. And, I kind of work at the surface there. I'm not a deep expert, but yeah, there's already existing infrastructure today to purchase offsets.
That's really interesting. Is this in a global setting, do you think? Because, at the very beginning, you said that there are people that emit 28 tons and and the global average is 6.1 tons, right? So I think it's fair to assume that in some parts of the world, we have less emissions, or we don't track those emissions as efficiently. And then in other parts of the world, we have more. Are we looking at a global carbon market?
It's already global today. Yeah. Some countries will have their own, but there's around the world, from Africa all the way to, Europe and North America, there's already credits available. And a lot of the projects are very global in nature.
So you've had this fantastic opportunity of coming to Dubai to attend COP28. So I was quite curious to understand, what's your motivation and what do you hope to get from attending an event like this?
I have two main motivations. I want to raise the volume on the literacy piece, and that leads to the what we can do now piece. And how do we scale climate solutions that actually work? I think that there's a lot of talk around everything, and there's a lot of noise around what can we do for 2030, 2040 and beyond. But the reason why carbon literacy is so important is because you can do it today. It doesn't cost a lot of money. You don't have to build new infrastructure at all. And it can be done really quickly. And it can help more people take action in a way that is meaningful. So I want to continue to raise the volume on that. And we'll actually have a panel in the Green Zone where we will be talking about carbon literacy with Martina Donlin from the UN. She leads the Act Now campaign on individual action, as well as Ellen Jakowski, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at MasterCard. And, MasterCard does a lot of work around carbon literacy as well, and they have the carbon calculator. So that is one of my motivations. My second motivation is to represent our women in climate community. We have thousands of people all over the world who care deeply about the planet and want to take climate action. Some of them are here in person, and a lot of them cannot be. And so I want to be here to help represent our interests in climate action, and also make sure that our community members have a chance to share their voice. So we have a Women in Climate speaker database that was actually born from COP27. When I went, I saw a huge opportunity for more women to speak. And 6 months later, we launched the speaker database in about May. We had maybe 100 speakers when we launched, which was really not bad at all. And today, we're probably over 750 speakers representing women. And so I want to make sure people use this as a resource, and we normalize having gender balanced, everything balanced panels where possible, because that's where we really drive action, is through having different perspectives and having conversations.
Fantastic. I love that. So thank you, Michelle, for sharing your knowledge on sustainability with us today. It's clear we still have a long way to go on a global level and on a local level as well. But I think you did give us some indicators on how we can start, which I think is fantastic. And I'll definitely be applying some of those too. We like to close off the episode with a teaser of a wildcard question that will be released in our bonus episode. And this allows our listeners to reflect and digest on the conversation we've just had, and to think about how they themselves would answer the question before they tune into the episode next week. So, Michelle, I'd like to ask you the following question. With the rise of stakeholder capitalism, we can say that the future of business is ESG centric. Can you paint a picture of what the future of work looks like in this scenario? Okay, so we'll press pause there. And we'd like to thank you for your time, for taking time out to speak with us today. It's been a pleasure. And we look forward to picking this up in the bonus episode. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Michelle.